My name is Walter Colombo. I ran a cinema once in Milan on a side street that smelled of stale popcorn and wet cobblestones. I tell people that first because it is the smallest, truest thing I own. Everything that came after has been borrowed time, borrowed air, borrowed lives. The cinema is the one thing that was mine. I am telling you this from the inside of a pod that should not exist, in a year that no longer has a name, and I am telling it the way an old man tells it, which is to say I will skip the parts that bore me and linger on the parts that still hurt. I am 61 years old. I have buried more people than I have kissed. I will try to do this right. The colon came down on a Tuesday in late autumn. I remember because we had a matinee scheduled, and I was arguing on the phone with a distributor about the print of a film I no longer remember the name of. Then the sky over the Duomo went the color of old iron, and the distributor stopped talking, and somewhere behind him, I heard a sound that I would later learn was the sound an entire human throat makes when it forgets how to be afraid and remembers how to be prey. They were not ships. That was the first wrong thing. We had all watched the movies, my generation. We knew what an invasion was supposed to look like: saucers, lights, a man with a bullhorn telling everyone to remain calm. The colon did not give us anything to recognize. They were lattices, black, articulated, kilometers across, unfolding in the upper atmosphere the way a beetle unfolds its wings, except a beetle has the decency to be small. By the time the news anchors had finished saying the word phenomenon, the lattices had finished unfolding, and the cities under them had finished existing. Milan did not burn. Milan was simply edited. One moment there was a skyline I had known since I was a boy. The next moment there was a flat plane of green-black glass with my cinema, and the distributor's office, and the school where my cousin's children had learned to read, all gone, not rubble, not ash, gone, as if a hand had reached down and lifted them out of the world and closed the gap behind. I was outside the perimeter by maybe 200 meters. The wind smelled of ozone and burned hair. I sat down on the curb and I did not cry, because I did not yet understand what crying would have been for. That is where the world before ended. The rest is what I did after. I will not give you the full chronicle of the first year. Better men have written it down, and most of them are dead now, and the manuscripts are gone. The short version is that the colon did not want us as slaves and did not want us as food. They wanted the planet, and they wanted it tidy, and tidy meant fewer of us. They did not negotiate. They did not threaten. They built. Their lattices unfolded into towers, and their towers unfolded into harvesters, and the harvesters ate cities the way a man eats bread, methodically, without apology, without rush. By the second summer there were maybe 40 million of us left on the European peninsula. By the third, half that. I was not a soldier. I was a man who knew how to splice a film projector and how to argue with suppliers, and that turned out to be more useful than you would think. The resistance, and I am laughing at myself for using that word, because at the time we just called it us, needed people who could fix things and lie to officials, and I could do both. They put me in salvage. We went into the dead zones at night and we pulled out anything that still worked. Generators, medicine. Once, a refrigerator full of cheese, which we ate in the back of a truck, while a harvester ground its way through what used to be Bergamo 2 valleys over. I have never tasted anything so good or so obscene. It was in salvage that I met Ascanio. Ascanio Orsini Veraldo. The full name every time, because that was the only thing he had brought with him out of the old world and he was not letting go of it. A Roman, of course. One of the old families, the kind that had a coat of arms older than most countries. Before the lattices came down, he had been something between a prince and a nuisance, a man with a title and a palazzo, and a way of looking at northerners like we were a regional disappointment. The colon did not care about coats of arms. They flattened his palazzo and most of his family inside it, and they sent him north with the other refugees, and somewhere in the freight car between Orvieto and what used to be Florence he decided that the only thing left to do was fight. The first time I saw him he was holding a wine bottle by the neck, and explaining to a Sicilian sergeant why the sergeant's plan was beneath the dignity of a man with our shared lineage, which was funny because Ascanio and the sergeant had never met and shared no lineage at all. He had the long Roman face, the kind that looks carved even when it is tired, and a voice that could fill a courtyard. I disliked him immediately. He disliked me back. I was, after all, Milanese. We were, in his words, the people who had invented punctuality and lost the soul of the country in the process. I told him the soul of the country had been ground into glass in the second summer, and that perhaps we could discuss regional pride after the harvesters were gone. He looked at me for a long moment, and then he laughed. It was not a kind laugh, but it was a laugh, and in the third year of the occupation, a laugh was worth more than a wine bottle. We worked the same salvage cell for 8 months, and we did not become friends. We became something more useful than friends. We became two men who could predict each other's bad ideas. He was rash where I was cautious. I was patient where he was proud. When the cell was ambushed outside what used to be Piacenza, it was Ascanio who pulled me out of a culvert with a coal and harvester drone 50 meters away, and it was me who kept him from running back for a body that was already past saving. We did not talk about it after. There was no need. Then the Mortimer thing happened, and the small, ugly war I had been fighting became something else. I should explain Mortimer. Everyone has heard the name now, but in those days he was a rumor and a punchline and a hope, in roughly that order. Edgar Mortimer had been a physicist at a university whose name I will not say because I do not want to lie about which one. He was American by birth and Italian by marriage and stubborn by both. Before the lattices, he had been working on something he called temporal displacement, not time travel. He hated that phrase, but the controlled folding of a small enclosed volume out of the present moment and into an adjacent one. The military had given him money for years and then taken the money back when the math stopped behaving. By the time the colon came down, he was working out of a converted barn outside Anzio with 3 graduate students, and a generator that he had stolen, in his own words, fair and square. The resistance found him in the 2nd year. By the 3rd, he had a working prototype. By the 4th, which is when this story really begins, he had a problem he could not solve. The prototype, which everyone called the machine and which Mortimer himself called the pod because he hated drama, could move a man, one man, sometimes 2 if they were small, backwards along the line of his own life, into the body he had occupied at an earlier point. Not into the past as a tourist, into the past as himself. You went asleep in the pod in the 4th year of the occupation, and you woke up inside your own 20-year-old skull, with all the memories of what was to come riding behind your eyes like a second passenger. You had a window, sometimes hours, sometimes days. Mortimer could not predict it, and then you snapped back to the pod and to the present and to whatever you had been before. The military application was obvious. Send a man back into a critical decision, into a meeting where the wrong call was made, into the moment before the lattices unfolded and have him change it. Warn the right general. Plant the right doubt. Build the right weapon. We had all read the books, we knew the paradoxes, but Mortimer had answers for the paradoxes. He said the line of history was not a string but a rope, and a rope can be rebraided. He said the colon themselves had given him the clue, because the colon perceived time as a fixed lattice and any disturbance in that lattice rang like a bell, and a bell that rings has been struck. He said a great deal of things, Mortimer did, and most of them I did not understand. What I understood was that he wanted volunteers, and that the volunteers tended not to come back right. The first 3 came back catatonic. The 4th came back screaming and did not stop for 2 days and then died. The 5th came back fine for about an hour and then began speaking only in Latin and could not be made to stop. Mortimer wept after each one. He was that kind of man. He kept refining the equations, and he kept asking for more volunteers, and the resistance kept sending them, because the alternative was to keep losing the war-won harvester at a time, and the harvesters did not stop to weep. Ascanio and I were not supposed to be volunteers. We were supposed to be the salvage cell that brought Mortimer a particular component he needed, a kind of superconducting coil that had survived inside a research facility outside Pisa that the colon had not yet edited. We went in at night. We came out with the coil and with 3 of our 6 people dead, including a young woman named Chiara, whom Ascanio had been training, and who had reminded me, in a way I did not enjoy, of a girl I had known in Milan in 1973. We delivered the coil to Mortimer's barn at dawn. We were filthy and exhausted, and Ascanio's left hand had stopped working properly because something had hit it during the extraction, and he was not telling anyone. Mortimer thanked us, he fed us, he installed the coil, and then he told us he had a problem. The pod, he said, was now stable enough to send 2 men, but the 2 men had to be paired. Some quirk of the equations, he tried to explain it and I tried to understand it, and we both gave up, meant that 2 travelers, properly entangled, would anchor each other against the dissociation that had killed or broken every solo traveler so far. The mind, Mortimer said, was not built to hold 2 timelines at once, but 2 minds, held together by sufficient mutual context, could. 2 minds, he said, that knew each other very well. Ascanio and I looked at each other across Mortimer's kitchen table. We had been arguing about which of us had loaded a magazine wrong 6 hours earlier, when Chiara was alive. We said no, of course, both of us, immediately. I said it more politely. Ascanio said it the way a Roman prince says no, which is to say he made it sound like an insult to anyone who had ever asked. Mortimer nodded. He had expected that. He told us to think about it. He told us that the alternative was that he would have to send 2 strangers and watch them come back wrong, and that he was tired of watching that. He told us where he wanted to send us. He wanted to send us back to the Tuesday in late autumn when the lattices unfolded. He had narrowed the critical window down to a 4-hour span centered on the moment the first harvester touched down outside Naples. He had also, through means he would not explain, identified a single point of intervention, a transmission from a colon command lattice that, if interrupted at the right second, would force the entire invasion to recalibrate. Not stop, not undo, recalibrate. Buy us, in his estimation, between 6 and 11 additional months before the harvesters began their work. 6 to 11 months. It does not sound like much, said out loud, but I had been in salvage for 3 years by then, and I knew what 6 months meant. It meant evacuations that could actually happen. It meant the children who were now dead might be elsewhere instead. It meant my sister, who had been in Bergamo, might have made it to the coast. I said yes that night. Ascanio said yes the next morning. He did not say it to me. He said it to Mortimer in the barn with his back to me, and then he walked past me without looking and went to clean his rifle. That was how he agreed to die with me. I understood it perfectly. We trained for 6 weeks. Mortimer drilled us on the timing of the transmission, on the exact frequency, on the physical location of the relay we would need to disable, a node buried in a research station on Vesuvius that, in the original timeline, we had not known existed until 2 years after it had eaten Naples. He drilled us on what our younger selves would have been doing on that Tuesday. Mine was easy. I was at the cinema, on the phone, arguing about a print. Ascanio's was less easy. He had been at a horse auction outside Rome, which is a sentence that still makes me laugh when I am alone. Mortimer made us memorize our own movements. He made us memorize each other's movements. He made us memorize the position of every clock in our respective lives at every hour of that Tuesday, because the snapback, he said, was sensitive to anchoring, and an anchor that drifted could kill us. We did not become friends in those 6 weeks. We became something stranger. We became 2 men who knew the contents of each other's pockets on the worst day of either of our lives. The morning of the jump, Mortimer made us coffee. Real coffee from beans he had been hoarding for a year. He poured it into 2 small cups and he set them in front of us and he said, "If this works, you will not remember this. You will not remember me. You will not remember the war. You will wake up on that Tuesday and you will have one impulse, which is to go to Vesuvius, and you will not know why. Ascanio said, "And if it does not work?" Mortimer said, "Then you will remember everything and you will come back to the pod, and we will try something else." He did not say the third option. The third option was that we would come back broken like the others. He did not have to say it. We had seen the others. I drank my coffee. Ascanio drank his. We climbed into the pod. The pod was smaller than I had expected. 2 seats, side by side, with a curved canopy that closed over us like the lid of a cooking pot. There were no instruments visible. Mortimer ran everything from outside. The last thing I saw before the canopy sealed was his face, lined and tired and kind, and the last thing I heard was him saying in Italian, "Forgive me, gentlemen, for what I am about to do to you." Then the world did the thing the world does when you are being pulled out of it. I want to be careful here, because what I am about to describe did not happen the way memory has it. Memory has organized it into a story. At the time it was not a story. At the time it was a dismantling. I felt the inside of my own skull come apart along seams I had not known were there. I felt every year of my life standing up at once and walking around inside me. I felt Ascanio next to me, not as a body but as a second pressure, a second weight on the same scale, and I understood, in a way I have never been able to explain since, that Mortimer had been right. That without him I would have come apart and stayed apart, and that the reason the other travelers had broken was that they had been alone in a place where being alone is not survivable. Then the dismantling stopped, and I was 28 years old and the phone was ringing. I was standing in my office above the cinema. The smell of popcorn was so strong I almost fell down. The phone was the old kind, with the curled cord, and the distributor was on the other end, and outside the window the sky was the wrong color but not yet the right kind of wrong. It was the Tuesday. It was the morning of the Tuesday. I had 3 hours and 40 minutes before the first lattice unfolded over Naples. And I had Ascanio's voice inside my head in a place where a voice should not be, saying, "Walter, move." I moved. I will skip the small mechanics of how a man explains to his 1996 secretary that he is leaving for Naples immediately and will be back in 2 days, when in fact he has not aged into this body in 26 years and has forgotten how to drive the kind of car he owned at the time. I will skip the moment I caught sight of myself in the bathroom mirror at the petrol station outside Bologna and had to sit down on the tile floor because the face looking back at me was a face I had buried. I will skip the call I made to my sister in Bergamo, the call I had not made in real life, in which I told her I loved her and asked her to take her children to the coast that weekend for no reason she would accept, and in which she laughed at me and said I sounded drunk. She was alive. She was alive in that phone call. I had not heard her voice in 8 years. I drove south. Ascanio, I learned later, was doing the same thing from his auction in Lazio, with his own younger body and his own younger reflexes, and his own ghost of a future riding in the passenger seat. We had agreed to meet at a service station north of Naples at 1400 hours. I got there at 1350. He got there at 1352, in a car that cost more than my cinema, wearing a suit I remembered him complaining about. He looked at me across the petrol pumps and he did not say hello. He said, "You drive. I will navigate. The road to Vesuvius is bad." We drove. The research station was where Mortimer had said it would be. The road was worse than he had said. We left the car a kilometer below the gate and went the rest of the way on foot. Through scrub and volcanic ash, both of us in clothes that were absurd for the terrain. Ascanio had brought a hunting rifle from the trunk of his car. I had brought, God help me, a tire iron. We were 28 and 31 years old, and we were trying to break into a facility that in 3 hours would help end the world. The gate was guarded by 2 men in unmarked uniforms. They were human, which was the part that took me a moment to understand. The colon in the original timeline had not done their work alone. There had been collaborators. There are always collaborators, and the research station on Vesuvius had been one of theirs. a place where a small group of human scientists had been working on signal protocols for an arrival they had been promised would make them rulers of what was left. Mortimer had not told us this part. I understood, standing in the scrub with a tire iron in my hand, why he had not. He had been afraid we would refuse. Ascanio shot the first guard from 40 meters with a hunting rifle meant for boar. The second guard ran. Ascanio shot him too. He was a better shot at 31 than he had ever been at 56, which makes a certain horrible sense. The hands had been younger, the eyes had been clearer, and only the will had been the same. He did not look at me after. He worked the bolt and he walked toward the gate, and I followed him with my tire iron, and we did not speak. Inside the station were 6 more men. 2 of them were armed. 4 of them were scientists, in the loose sense that the word can be applied to men who have agreed to sell their species for a promotion. Ascanio handled the armed ones. I handled one of the scientists, the youngest, who tried to run for an alarm. I hit him with the tire iron in the side of the head, and he fell down, and he did not get up, and I have thought about that man, that boy really, every day for 33 years. He was 23. He had a wedding ring. I have never asked who she was. The relay was in the basement. It was the size of a refrigerator, and it was humming. Mortimer had given us a sequence, 3 switches, a dial, a cable to pull. We executed the sequence at 14:47 hours. The hum changed pitch. A red light came on. Ascanio looked at me and said, in the voice of a man much older than the body he was in, "We have to leave now." We left. We drove back north. The radio, as we drove, began to say strange things. It said that observatories in 3 countries were reporting an anomaly in the upper atmosphere. It said that the anomaly was changing shape. It said that whatever had been about to happen was now not happening, and that no one knew why, and that the Italian government was asking citizens to remain calm. The lattices did not unfold over Naples that Tuesday. We snapped back to the pod 9 hours later, both of us, alive and oriented and crying in a way that 2 grown men do not usually cry in front of each other. Mortimer was leaning over the canopy. His face was wet. He said, "You did it, you did it, you did it." He said it like a prayer. The recalibration had bought us, in the end, 8 months and 17 days. That was the window Mortimer had bought with our hands. The colon came back in the summer, on a Thursday, with a different protocol and a more careful approach, and the lattices unfolded then, and the harvesters did their work then, and the world ended on a slightly different schedule. But in those 8 months and 17 days, every government on the planet that had ever doubted Mortimer wrote him a blank check. In those 8 months and 17 days, we evacuated 3 of the 4 largest coastal cities in southern Europe. In those 8 months and 17 days, my sister and her children took a ferry to Sardinia that, in the original timeline, they had never lived to board. They are alive now, the children. The youngest is a grandmother. She does not know my name. She is alive. That was the first jump. There were 9 more. I will not give you all 9. The middle ones blur, the way a string of bad weeks in a long campaign blurs. But 3 of them stand out, and I will give you those, because they are the ones in which I learned what we had actually become. The second jump was Geneva in 1987. Mortimer had located a meeting, an arms control session mid-tier, the kind of meeting that did not make the front pages but that wrote the language other meetings would later sign. 2 clauses of a particular annex, he said, if rewritten, would leave the resistance, 3 decades later, with a stockpile of conventional ordnance the colon had not anticipated. The harvesters, he said, were vulnerable to certain old-fashioned munitions in certain quantities, and the original annex had banned exactly those quantities, and a small adjustment in the right briefcase would unban them. Ascanio went alone for that one. His younger self, in 1987, had been an attaché to the Italian delegation, a position he had taken as a young man to please his father and had quit a year later out of boredom. I stayed in the pod as the anchor, awake, conscious, holding the line for him from the inside the way Mortimer would later hold the line for both of us on the last jump. It is a hard thing to describe. I sat in the pod for 9 hours by Mortimer's clock, and I was also, in a way, in a hotel room in Geneva in 1987, watching Ascanio's hand move across a folder he had not opened since he was 30. He swapped the pages. He closed the folder. He went down to the lobby and ordered a whiskey and drank it slowly and looked at his hands. I felt him looking. I felt him think, in a voice I was not sure he meant me to hear, that his father had once stood in that lobby and ordered the same whiskey and had told a young Ascanio that the family name was a thing to be carried, not spent. I felt Ascanio answer his father silently that he was spending it now, on a folder, on a war his father would never know about, and that he hoped the old man would have approved. He snapped back at the agreed hour. The annex changed. Decades later, in our timeline, a warehouse in Slovenia held 40,000 rounds of an artillery shell that, in the original timeline, had been illegal to manufacture. The pilots who used those shells called them Geneva rounds and did not know why. The fourth jump was Houston in 2003. That one was mine. There was a metallurgist at a research laboratory there, a woman named Diane Whittaker, whom I had never met and would never meet, who was about to publish a paper on a tungsten alloy used in armor plating. The original paper had specified a ratio of carbon that, by a small margin, made the alloy easier for the colon harvesters to chew. A different ratio, marginally less efficient by every metric a 2003 metallurgist would care about, would make the alloy harder. Mortimer had located a single afternoon at a single conference at which Dr. Whittaker would be approachable. He needed a body for me to inhabit. He had found one, a junior research associate at a competing lab, a man named Walter Hill, who had been at that conference and who shared. By coincidence, Mortimer found suspicious and amusing in equal measure my given name. Walter Hill had been a man of no particular consequence who had drifted out of the field a year later. Walter Hill, for one afternoon, would be me. I woke up in his body in a Houston hotel room in the morning of the conference. The body was 34, taller than mine, slightly heavier, with a wedding ring I did not recognize and a wife I had to assume existed somewhere, and a Texas driver's license that I studied for 20 minutes in the bathroom mirror, trying to memorize a signature that was not mine. I went to the conference. I sat through 3 presentations on materials science I did not understand. I drank bad coffee from a paper cup. At the afternoon reception, I found Dr. Whittaker at the edge of the room, holding a glass of wine she was not drinking, and I introduced myself with a name that was not mine. She was younger than I had expected, maybe 35. She had the look of a woman who had been corrected too many times by men who knew less than she did and was on the verge of stopping caring. I had 3 hours before the snapback. I had no academic standing. I had no credentials she would accept. I had only Mortimer's brief, a single sentence. Tell her about the carbon ratio, and tell her in a way she will remember. I told her about my grandfather, who had been a blacksmith in a village outside Brescia, and who had taught me when I was a boy that a blade is not the carbon in it, but the way the carbon argues with the iron. I told her, in the voice of Walter Hill, but with the words of Walter Colombo, that her paper as written would make a strong alloy but a brittle one, and that brittleness was a kind of pride in a metal, a refusal to bend, and that the world that her alloy would have to live in was not a world that would forgive pride. I do not know where the words came from. I had not planned them. She listened. She did not interrupt. When I had finished, she looked at me for a long moment and she said, "Are you all right, Dr. Hill?" I said, "I do not know. I have not slept well." She said, "Send me your numbers. I want to look at this." She gave me her card. I took it. I left the reception. I walked back to the hotel through Houston heat that I had not been built for, in a body that was not mine, and I sat on the edge of a stranger's bed and I waited to snap back. And I thought about my grandfather, who had in fact been a blacksmith in a village outside Brescia, and who had in fact taught me what I had just told her, and who had been dead since I was 19, and had never imagined any of this. I snapped back at midnight. Dr. Whittaker, in our timeline, published a paper 4 months later with a different carbon ratio. The harvesters, when they came, had a harder time eating our tanks. Walter Hill, in our timeline, drifted out of metallurgy and into insurance and died in 2019 of an ordinary heart attack, and I have lit a candle for him every year, in the cinema lobby, in a place where no one sees. The sixth jump was the one I do not talk about, even with myself, except when I am writing this down. We jumped to Sarajevo in 1992. Mortimer had identified a man, a colon collaborator, decades before there was a colon to collaborate with, a man whose later writings would form the philosophical basis for the human accommodation with the lattices, a man whose name I will not write because his children are still alive and do not deserve to know what he would have been. Mortimer wanted him stopped. Stopped, not killed. Mortimer was very precise about that, and Ascanio and I had agreed before we got in the pod. We jumped. We found him. He was 26 years old in a city under siege in a basement apartment with no electricity, writing the first draft of what would have become his life's work by candlelight. He was thin. He had a cough. He looked at us across the basement when we came down the stairs, and he was not frightened, which I think is the part that has stayed with me. He said in English, because he had no way of knowing what language we spoke, "I have been expecting someone." We talked to him. We talked to him for 4 hours. Ascanio did most of the talking. I do not know what Ascanio said to him, because Ascanio said it in the man's own language, which Ascanio had somehow learned in the body he was wearing, and I have never asked. At the end of the 4 hours, the man burned his manuscript in a tin pail in the corner of the basement, and he shook our hands, and he asked us in English again whether what he had been about to write had been very evil. Ascanio said, "It would have been used for very evil things." The man nodded. He said, "Thank you for telling me." We left. We snapped back. The man in our timeline survived the siege, became a school teacher, and died in 2030, one of natural causes, beloved by his grandchildren. I have read his obituary. I keep it in the same drawer as this notebook. We jump to the year 79 of the Common Era. That one I will tell you about, because it is the one I dream about. Mortimer had found, in the back of an obscure paper, a reference to a mineral deposit on the slopes of Vesuvius that had been buried under the ash of the Great Eruption and never recovered. The deposit, properly refined, was the only known terrestrial source of a compound that disrupted colon lattice signaling at the molecular level. In our timeline, the deposit was gone, vaporized when the harvesters edited the Bay of Naples. In a different timeline, one in which a small group of survivors had reached the deposit before the eruption and moved it inland, the compound might exist in sufficient quantity to coat the hulls of our remaining aircraft. The problem was that the snapback in that era did not have a young Walter or a young Ascanio to anchor to. Mortimer had to do something he had never done, which was send us in cold, without bodies of our own to inhabit. He called it a hard jump. He said it would feel different. He said it might not work. It worked. It worked the way a butcher's knife works. We woke up in our own bodies, our old bodies, the bodies we had climbed into the pod with, lying in volcanic ash on the slope of a mountain we had only seen in photographs, in a sky the color of an apricot. Vesuvius was smoking above us. Below us, in a valley that would in a few hours not exist, was a town I will not name because the name will hurt you if you know your history. The first thing I noticed was the smell. Not the volcano. The volcano smelled the way Mortimer had warned us it would, a kind of acrid hot metal smell that made the back of the throat close. The smell I had not been warned about was olive trees. There was a grove of them on the slope below us, and the leaves were turning in a small wind. And the smell of them was the smell of every summer of my childhood, when my grandmother had owned a single tree in her courtyard, and had pressed the oil herself in a stone press that had been older than the house. I sat in the ash and I smelled olive trees, and I did not move for 30 seconds, because the smell was so much more present than any smell had been in the years of the occupation, when nothing had smelled like anything but smoke. Ascanio nudged me with his boot. He said, "Walter, the mountain." His voice was the voice of a man who had also smelled the olive trees and had also not moved for 30 seconds. We had 8 hours, we had a map, we had each other. The map was Mortimer's, drawn on a piece of waxed cloth, marked with a route up the slope that he had calculated from geological surveys done 18 centuries after the day we were standing in. The route avoided the village paths because the village paths would be in use, and would be in use by people who would in a few hours be dead, and Mortimer had been very firm that we were not to interact with them, not to be seen by them, not to leave a single memory of 2 strange old men climbing past a herder's stone wall on the morning of the eruption. We climbed off path. The ash was already falling lightly, the way snow falls before a storm understands what it is going to be. The pieces were small. They settled in Ascanio's hair, which was white by then, and made him look like a man in a dusting of flour. He did not notice. I did not tell him. The mineral deposit was where Mortimer had said it would be, in a cave a kilometer up the slope, in nodules the size of a man's fist. We dug them out with our hands because Mortimer had not given us tools, on the theory that tools left in a cave in the year 79 might be found in the year 1879 and might change something he could not predict. So we used our hands. Ascanio's hands bled first. Then mine did. The nodules were warm, which I had not expected. They felt the way a stone feels when it has been sitting in the sun, except the cave had no sun in it, and the warmth was coming from the mountain, and the mountain was telling us in its own language that we did not have 8 hours, that we had perhaps 6, that we should hurry. We did not speak. We had stopped speaking in the field somewhere around the 4th jump. There was nothing to say that the other did not already know. We filled 2 sacks Mortimer had given us, made of a synthetic fiber that would burn to nothing in the eruption and leave no trace. We tied the sacks. We shouldered them. We started down. The town below us we could not save. Mortimer had been very clear about that. The town below us was a fixed point. The town below us had been written into the rope, and the rope was not infinitely rebraidable, and if we tried to warn it, we would snap back early or not snap back at all, and the nodules would be lost and the war would be lost. We knew this. We had agreed to it in the barn in Anzio, over coffee, on a morning when the town was an abstraction. The town, now, was not an abstraction. The town had smoke coming from its chimneys. The town had a man on a road below us driving 2 donkeys with a stick and shouting at them in a Latin I half recognized, the same Latin my grandmother had used for the parts of the Mass she had refused to update. The town had a bakery. I could smell that too, faintly, under the olive trees and the sulfur, and the bakery was working because it was morning and the day was a day like any other, and the people in it were going to die. We dug, we carried, we walked, we watched because we could not watch as the mountain above us began to do the thing the mountain was always going to do. There was a sound first, a sound under the sound, the kind of sound that you feel in your sternum before you hear it in your ears. Then there was a shake. Then there was a crack at the summit that was not a sound but an absence of sound, a hole in the air through which all other sounds briefly fell. Then there was the column. I had seen pictures of the column in books. The pictures had not prepared me. The column went up faster than a thing that size has any right to go up. It went up and it kept going up, and it opened at the top into a shape that I have never been able to describe to anyone who was not standing on that slope. I remember a child. I remember a child on a rooftop looking up. She was perhaps 6. She was barefoot. Her hair was the color of wet straw. She was on the flat roof of a small house at the edge of the village, and she had been sent up there, I think, to take down laundry, because there was a basket beside her and a sheet half folded over the edge of the basket. She saw us, 2 old men in strange clothing carrying sacks down a path no one had used in a generation. She raised her hand. I do not know if she was waving or pointing. I raised my hand back. Ascanio did not look. Ascanio had a daughter at her age, in the timeline before the timeline. Ascanio had buried that daughter in the 2nd year of the occupation, before he and I had ever met. Ascanio kept walking and did not look. I have never been angry with him for that. I have only ever been angry with myself for looking. The child looked up at the column. She did not run. Children do not run from things they have never been taught to fear. She put her small hand on the basket and she watched the sky, and the sky watched her back. I have wondered often in the years since whether she understood what she was seeing. I have decided, in the way an old man decides such things, that she did not, and that this is the closest thing to mercy that the morning offered her. She had been alive, I have told myself, and then she had not been alive, and the space between had been very short and full of awe. I do not know if I believe this. I tell it to myself anyway. We made it to the snapback point with the nodules. The mountain did what the mountain was going to do. The sound behind us in the last minute before the snap was a sound I will not try to describe because I do not have the right. We came home. The compound, when Mortimer's people refined it, worked. We coated 41 aircraft with it. Those 41 aircraft, in a battle over the Adriatic in what would have been the 6th year of the occupation, took down a command lattice. It was the first lattice we had ever taken down. The pilots called it the apricot run because someone had told them about a sky the color of an apricot. They did not know why. I am telling you all of this in a kind of order that did not exist while we were doing it. While we were doing it, we did not know if it was working. We knew that the timeline kept changing under our feet, and that Mortimer kept getting older, and that the barn outside Anzio kept getting bigger and better funded, as the resistance turned into something that could almost be called an army. We knew that some of our people, the ones who had not been on the jumps, sometimes did not remember things we remembered, because for them those things had never happened. My sister was alive. My sister had always been alive for them. Only Ascanio and I remembered the freight car between Orvieto and what used to be Florence. Only Ascanio and I remembered Chiara. The 10th jump was the last one. Mortimer was 81 by then. The resistance had become a coalition. We had bought, by his count, 17 years of additional time across the cumulative timeline, and we had built in those years weapons the colon had not seen coming, and we had a plan. The plan required one more jump. The plan required us to go back, not to a Tuesday in autumn, but to a moment that predated the colon themselves, a moment in the deep history of their own species, before they had developed the lattice perception that made them what they were, when they had been merely an aggressive silicate-based colony organism on a moon I will not try to pronounce, 8,000 light-years and 112,000 years from here. Mortimer could not send us into a body in that era. There were no bodies of ours to send us into. He could send us, he said, as a presence, as a pressure, as a signal in the lattice the colon had not yet learned to read. He could send us to ring the bell hard at the precise moment a particular biochemical pathway was developing in a particular colony of organisms on a particular moon, and he could make the bell sound like a predator, and the colony might, in response, develop differently. It might never develop the lattice perception. It might remain a silicate colony on a moon forever and never look up. It was a hard sell, even from Mortimer. We did not understand it. We did not need to. He told us he would not survive sending it. He told us the equations required a third anchor on the inside, and that the third anchor was him. He told us he was 81 and his wife was 20 years dead and he had been ready for a long time. He told us he was sorry. Ascanio said, Edgar. It was the first time I had ever heard him use Mortimer's given name. Edgar, there has to be another way. Mortimer said, there is not. I am sorry. I would not lie to you, Ascanio, not now. I said, when? Mortimer said, tomorrow morning. That night we sat in the barn, the three of us, and we drank a bottle of wine that Mortimer had been saving for the wedding of a daughter who had died in the 3rd year. We did not talk about the jump. We talked about the cinema in Milan. Ascanio talked about his horses. Mortimer talked about a sailing trip he had taken in 1979 with his wife, off the coast of Maine, and the way the light had come down through the fog one morning and made the water look like beaten tin. He had a good memory for light, Mortimer did. He had been a physicist because he had wanted to know what light was, and he had ended up knowing more about time than any man alive, and he was about to throw that knowledge into a furnace on the chance that two old salvage men could ride it home one last time. In the morning we climbed into the pod. Mortimer did not climb in. He stayed at the console. He had wired himself into it, physically, by means I will not describe because I do not fully understand them and do not want to remember them. And his face, behind the canopy, was the face of a man at peace. He said, "Walter, Ascanio, I will see you on the other side of this if there is one. If there is not, I want you to know that I have been the most fortunate man I have ever met." He started the jump. The jump was not like the others. The others had been a dismantling. This one was a journey. We were not pulled out of our bodies, we were stretched, the way light is stretched when it passes a heavy star, and we were stretched across a distance that I do not have words for, because the distance was not in space and was not in time and was in some third thing that exists between them. I felt Ascanio beside me the whole way. I felt Mortimer behind us, holding the line, his grip slipping by degrees. I felt when we arrived that we were not anywhere. We were a pressure on a colony of organisms on a moon. We were the sound of a predator that the colony had never imagined, and we made that sound for as long as Mortimer could hold us there, which turned out to be 11 seconds, which turned out to be enough. The colony recoiled. The colony developed defenses against a predator that did not exist. The defenses, over millions of years, shaped the colony into something cautious, something local, something that never developed the trick of perceiving time as a lattice, because the trick had been a way of hunting and the hunting had been forgotten in the recoil. The colony stayed on its moon. The colon, as we had known them, never existed. We snapped back. The barn was empty. The pod was empty around us. The console was cold. Mortimer was gone, not dead exactly, because dead implies a body, and there was no body, only a small pile of ash on the floor of the barn in the shape of a man who had once known what light was. Outside, the world was the world. Milan was Milan. The Duomo was where I had left it. My cinema was where I had left it. The distributor I had argued with on a Tuesday in late autumn was, presumably, in his office, arguing with someone else. Ascanio and I walked out of the barn together. The sky was the right color. There were birds in it. He stood in the grass and he closed his eyes and he tilted his face up the way a man does when he has not felt the sun on his face in a long time, and he said, "Walter." I said, "Yes." He said, "I do not know what to do with this." I said, "Neither do I." We stood there for a while. Then we walked down the road to the village and we found a cafe that, in the world we had just made, had never been edited out, and we sat down at a table outside, and we ordered 2 coffees from a young woman who did not know what a colon was, who had never heard the word lattice used as a verb, who had never had to bury a brother in a field at night because the harvesters were 3 valleys over and time was short. She brought us our coffees. She smiled at us. She thought, I am sure, that we were 2 odd old men who had walked too far on a warm afternoon. We drank our coffees. Ascanio paid. He insisted. He said it was a Roman's privilege to buy a Milanese a coffee on the day the world had been returned to them, and I told him that he had not changed, and he laughed his unkind laugh and said that neither had I. That was 33 years ago. I am 61 now, in the body that has always been mine, in the timeline that is the only one anyone else remembers. Ascanio died last spring in his sleep in his bed, in a palazzo that the colon had never flattened because the colon had never existed. He was 84. His grandchildren were at the funeral. They thought he had been a difficult, charming, slightly mad old man with a great many strong opinions about cinema. They did not know he had once carried a sack of volcanic nodules down a slope under an apricot sky, while a child on a rooftop waved at him and he did not look. He had asked me, the last time I saw him, in the garden of his palazzo, with his hand on my arm, not to tell anyone, not the grandchildren, not the historians, not the priests. He said the world we had bought was a clean world, and the people in it deserved to live in it without our weight on their shoulders. I have honored that, Until tonight. I am telling you because I am the last one. Mortimer is ash. Ascanio is in the ground. The resistance is a word that does not exist in any newspaper in any language, because there was nothing to resist, because the lattices never came. I am the last man who remembers the Tuesday. I am the last man who remembers the smell of ozone over the Duomo. I am the last man who remembers Chiara, who was 22, and from a town near Brescia, and who could not load a magazine properly, and who laughed when you teased her about it, and who died in a culvert outside Piacenza in a war that no one fought. I am telling you because someone has to, not because the world owes us anything. The world owes us nothing. The world is doing what we bought it to do, which is to go on, ignorantly, beautifully, ordinarily, with its coffees and its grandchildren and its arguments about cinema. The world does not need to know. But I do not want Chiara to be only mine. I have written this down by hand, in a notebook, in my apartment above what is once again my cinema in Milan. I have written it in pencil, because pencil is what an old salvage man trusts. When I am finished, I will put it in a drawer, and the drawer in a desk, and the desk in a room, and the room in a building, and the building in a city that the colon never edited, and someday a great niece of mine, or a stranger, will open the drawer and read this and will not know whether to believe it, and that is fine. That is the right amount of belief for a story like this. We were two men who did not like each other, and we won a war that no one else will ever remember fighting. And we did it because we could not stop ourselves from being what we were: stubborn, mismatched, mortal, willing to walk down a mountain past a child. We could not save because the mountain had been written into the rope, and the rope was not infinitely rebraidable. The colon, in the end, did not understand us. They had perceived time as a lattice, and we had perceived it as a road, and a road can be walked in either direction by a man who is too tired and too angry to stop. They had been very good at being what they were. They had not been good at imagining what we were. That, in the end, was the whole thing. That was the entire war. Outside my window in Milan, the sky is the color it is supposed to be. A tram is going past. A woman is laughing on the street below at something a man has said to her, and the man is laughing too. I do not know them. I will never know them. They will live their whole lives without ever hearing the word lattice used as a verb. I am going to close the notebook now. I am going to put it in the drawer. I am going to go downstairs and lock the cinema, because there is a matinee tomorrow, and I have a print to check, and a distributor to argue with, and the popcorn machine has been making a sound I do not like. I am Walter Colombo. I ran a cinema once in Milan, on a side street that smelled of stale popcorn and wet cobblestones. I tell people that first because it is the smallest, truest thing I own. It is enough.